Hey people, welcome to the Run Testers. Kieran here, and today we're going to be looking at this. This is the Polar Vantage V2. It is the follow-up to the original Vantage V. It is brand new, launched today. We have had it for a little while. We're one of the first people to actually get our hands on this, and we have put it through a little first run review just to give you a flavour of what you can expect from this watch. And we've done some early tests just to give you a look at how it performs so far. We will be doing a full review, so don't forget to like, subscribe, ring the bell, so when that review lands, you will get notified and be able to hear all of our thorough thoughts on the Polar Vantage V2. But for now, here's a look at what the Polar Vantage V brings to the table and how we found it in our early run test. Let's take a look. So the Polar Vantage V2 is the second generation of Polar's premium multi-sport watch. That's for run, bike, swim, and it actually comes with some new skills. It's got a longer battery life. Same battery life with full power GPS mode, that's 40 hours, but this can now extend, the same as we saw on the Polar Grit, with power saving settings that pulse the GPS lower, up to 100 hours. It's lighter as well at 52 grams. I think that's down 21% from the Vantage V, so it's slightly lighter on the wrist. It also comes with some really interesting new testing features, and it brings essentially all of the whole package of Polar's latest running training features into one package. So everything you've got on the Grit, you're going to find here. Everything that was on the original Vantage V here in this package too. So it is the most complete multi-sport watch, most complete running watch that you're going to find in Polar's lineup. So price-wise, the Vantage V2 comes in at £449 in the UK. That's $499 in the US. For context, that is £10 more expensive than the original Polar Vantage V price, though you can actually get a Polar Vantage V now for around £350 on Amazon if you look hard. So another couple of big headlines here are that FuelWise, the feature that we saw launched on the Grit that helps you work out how to fuel for longer endurance efforts, now comes to the Polar Vantage V2. It's something that we really wanted to see. Hill Splitter also, the tool that basically helps you automatically breaks down your ups and downs in your runs and gives you splits in Polar Flow. That's also now over on the Vantage V2, came first on the Grit X. You also get Komoot navigation, so turn-by-turn navigation that's powered by Komoot mapping. That's here now too. So a lot of those skills that we saw on the Grit X we really liked are now over on the Vantage V2. You are still getting running power on the wrist. You will still have Training Load Pro, Recovery Pro, which was something you don't get on the Grit X. You also have the option, if you don't want to use Recovery Pro that uses the orthostatic test with a chest strap, you can do nightly recharge, which is the optical heart rate recovery test that happens automatically in the background. You're also getting the Sleep Plus stages, so all that detailed sleep tracking that we saw with the Vantage V and the Grit X, that is now here on the Vantage V2 as well. So on top of those features that we're quite familiar with, and if you want to dive deeper into some of those, you can see them on our Grit X review that is on the channel. That will go deeper into some of those new features that we saw arrive with that watch. But on top of that, you're getting a couple of really interesting new tests within the test set that comes on the Polar Vantage V. So you formerly had a fitness test in there, and you also had an orthostatic test for recovery. Well, now you've got what's called a running performance test. Now these are two tests. There's a maximal and a sub-maximal test. They're guided tests that you do as a run on your watch. It tells you when to speed up and basically guides you around a maximal effort or a sub-maximal effort, depending on which one you want to do. Now, out of the back of those tests, what you get is some really interesting stats. You'll get an estimated VO2 max. You'll also get your max aerobic speed. So what these tests are really trying to do is kind of recreate some of those lab tests that you might have, an oxygen uptake VO2 max test in lab conditions on a treadmill, but make it more practical, more convenient, and something you can do more regularly without having to step into a lab and pay a lot of money. And something then can be used to guide all of your training from then on, giving you data that can help you run more optimally and more effectively as a result. So what you're getting out of that is you're going to get your VO2 max estimate. You're going to get a maximal heart rate estimate. So we all know the 220 minus your age kind of figure. Well, that's what we tend to use to input and mold and tweak our zones. But now this will do it automatically out of the back of this test if you want it to. You're also going to get a maximal aerobic speed reading and a maximal aerobic power reading. Don't forget that the Polar Vantage V and the V2 now have always had power on the wrist. So this is something that can help you guide your power related training zones from there in and after you do this test. Now, really usefully, what will happen is the Vantage V2 will automatically update all of your settings for heart rate, for power, for those things without you having to go in and tweak them. So you can do these tests regularly, for example, maybe once a month as benchmarks tests and have your data updated and be more accurate as you develop as a runner. Now, the second test that's really interesting for runners is the leg recovery test. Until now, we've really only been able to measure our aerobic recovery. But now with this leg recovery test, we're starting to be able to peer into how our muscles have recovered after a particularly long or a particularly hard, intense run. Now, what this is essentially is a jump test. You perform 3 jumps of a particular type. Again, Polar will guide you through the test on the watch. You just follow what you do. It's made very, very simple. And then it will give you a reading on how well your muscles have recovered based on a jump test, which is a test that's actually used regularly out there in the real world. But this now puts this on your wrist and gives you something to use as a guided test to measure your own recovery at the right times. So I decided to give the leg recovery test a try out the day after I ran a marathon, and here's how I got on. So one of the tests I wanted to do in this first run video was to take a look at the leg recovery test. Now, yesterday I ran a marathon, and I'm really interested to see what this test does, what it shows you, and how that marathon might have impacted on my recovery. So I'm going to do the test now and we'll see what the results say afterwards. So design-wise, you've got the same 240 by 240 pixel resolution display. It's exactly the same size as the original Vantage V. What you do have actually is an ambient light sensor in the V2 that is supposed to be there to help you kind of with visibility of the screen in all kinds of light. We've had no problems actually with seeing this outdoors in runs, up and down sort of lighting conditions. It performs pretty much as the V1. Visible, fine, all that's all good. The watch is actually lighter, as we mentioned earlier, but it's down to 52 grams from 66. The casing now, it's basically almost like a one-piece smooth kind of aluminium casing that feels kind of nice and premium. The strap is actually removable, so you can switch those out. It's a little bit more textured. It's smooth on the inside actually, where the original Vantage V was a bit more textured, so it's more comfortable on the inside. On the outside, you've got a bit more of a fabric feel, which I think I much prefer to the original. But yeah, you can remove those straps and replace them with other straps that are available if you want to pay extra money. You have the same 5-button controls on the outside, work in tandem with the touchscreen colour display. I found in my early tests that the touchscreen is actually a little bit more responsive than on the V1, which is a definite improvement, and the buttons are an infinite upgrade. Those buttons are so much more responsive than you found on the V1 original, and that was a really big bugbear that Polar have fixed, so we're happy with that. If you're into customization, Polar has kind of tried to get with the game here, and it allows you to choose from various different kind of watch faces, digital and analog, and play with the color themes. And you can also choose which of the screens you have in your sort of top level carousel to scroll through. You can change the order of those, remove some, add some, and add a bit more customization there depending on your preference. So flip it over and you have got the same optical heart rate sensor tech. That's Polar's Precision Prime optical heart rate sensor technology in there. And the other big difference here is that this is actually, the V2 is actually 100 meters water resistant, whereas the original was only 30. So that's a big change there too. So how have we found it? Well, hands up, we've only had the Polar Vantage V for about 5 days, but in that time, I took it out on a full marathon test. I've worn it non-stop since to look at the sleep tracking and some of the heart rate data. And you know, from a design perspective, I actually think this is a step up from the Vantage V. I think the design looks more sophisticated. I think it's actually more comfortable, not just because it's lighter, but also I think that sort of underside, this kind of smooth underside, sits more nice against the wrist, more comfortable against the wrist. The buttons are better, that is a definite win. The buttons and the controls are better. I think overall it's easier to control this. The touchscreen feels like it's a little bit less laggy, though it's still not as sharp as something like the Apple Watch, but it is now a bit more usable. I think the strap is actually more comfortable as well than the original Vantage V. So overall, from a design perspective, I'm actually really impressed. Screen's bright enough. It's always on display, it's really useful, so there's no raised awake like you'll have with some watches. So from our initial test, when it comes to battery life, we found that we got 4 days out of a single charge of this. That included 6.5 hours running with full GPS power mode on. We ran a full marathon in that. That was a 5-hour 10 marathon. And in that marathon, that used up 22% battery life with full GPS on and everything else firing. So continuous heart rate, smart notifications, all of those things switched on. So if you extrapolate from that, actually you're looking at about 20 to 25 hours full GPS, which falls way short of Polar's 40-hour claimed battery life mark. But there's a caveat here, which we've had this before with Polar watches. Actually, these things often need a factory reset, and that can fix some of the battery ills. So when we come to our full review, that's exactly what we'll do. So those initial battery findings are very much with this coming fresh out of the box. We wanted to test it as it was. But we're interested to see how after a factory reset, if you get the full 40 hours GPS, which we hope you will. And also in the 5 days, we haven't had time to test that low power GPS mode. So watch out for that when it comes in our review that will hit the channel soon. So we've come out, it's pretty wet and grey up here. I'm going to test the Polar Vantage V2 just to give it a quick first run test. We're going to look at the battery life, we'll have a look at how the GPS holds up. I'm going to compare it to the Grit X with a chest strap, a H10 chest strap, to see what the optical heart rate sensor is like on this. We're going to go and do hopefully 26 or so miles up and down the hills behind me, so let's go and have a look. So after what was a very wet, windy and blustery run, testing this, when it came to the heart rate, what we found actually was that the V2 had a tendency to read higher. Our max heart rate overall in that run, that marathon run, came in at 180 BPM up against the H10's 165. And actually beyond that, what was really notable was there were at least half a dozen spikes up into the top zone, our top heart rate zone, that weren't there on the H10's readings after the run. So it feels like the V2 has a tendency to spike and actually reads a little bit higher generally in terms of heart rate versus the H10 chest strap, which is kind of the gold standard. But that is definitely something that we are going to be paying attention to in the full review. That's just one run, so we're not going to make a judgment yet, but that is something now that we will go and look for in great detail when we do our full review, so watch out for that. So another interesting feature we got to test, this was a trail marathon that we did, so there were plenty of ups and downs. So Hill Splitter, which is now on the V2 and the Polar Grit X, we got to compare those two. And interestingly, the V2 clocked way lower in terms of the number of climbs than you got on the Grit X. So there were only 29 uphills on the V2 versus 36 on the Grit X. Now that equates as well in the totals on here to about 2 miles less elevation gained clocked on the V2. So there's a big discrepancy there, which is going to be interesting to peer into a little bit more as we go on and conduct our other tests too. And the final thing to say from that initial run test, obviously FuelWise now comes on the V2 as well. And what's really interesting is despite those discrepancies that we talked about in the heart rate, actually when it comes to the FuelWise breakdown in kind of the fuel sources that you use during the run, they were absolutely spot on, exactly the same between the Grit X with the H10 chest strap and the V2. We got 48% from carbs, 11% from protein, and 41% from fat during that marathon run. So despite those heart rate discrepancies, those two things have come in the same, which again is another interesting point that we're going to have to do some more investigating into, but there you go. So there you have it, that's our first run look at the brand new Polar Vantage V2, a very exciting piece of kit from Polar. We've obviously only had it for a little while and done some very sort of early testing. We can't wait to put this through the proper run testers paces. Subscribe, like, comment, ask us what you want to hear in the full review. Make sure you hit the notifications bell so you get alerted for when that full review arrives. We are going to go out and give this a proper thorough run testing, and we will be back with that review soon. Thanks for listening, and yeah, we'll see you again soon on the Run Testers.